I spent months renovating my parents' house, then Dad told me. Your sister needs it more. I didn't argue and just left. 24 hours later, they found out that I was. I ran my fingers along the freshly painted doorframe, still smelling of the deep blue coat I had carefully applied just last week. The new hardwood floors gleamed under the ceiling light, a stark contrast to the warped, creaky planks I had torn out months ago. Every corner of this house held a piece of me, sweat, money, and hope. And then, just like that, my father shattered it all. "You've done a great job, son," he said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "But your sister needs this place more than you do." I blinked. The words felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. "What?" I finally managed, my voice too steady for the storm raging inside me. Dad sighed, as if I was the unreasonable one. "You know how hard things have been for her since the divorce. She's got the kids. She needs a fresh start." I looked at my mother, hoping, begging, for some sign of protest. She just gave me a soft, pitying smile, as if she expected me to understand. "You told me this was for me," I said, my hands balling into fists. "That's the only reason I did all this. And we appreciate it," Mom added quickly. "But we thought you'd want to help your sister." "Help her?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I just spent months, renovating this place. My savings, my time, my work." Dad cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Don't make this difficult. You're a young man. You'll land on your feet." I felt something inside me crack. But I didn't argue. I didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't demand what was rightfully mine. I just walked past them, out the door, and into the night. And 24 hours later, they found out exactly who they had underestimated. I drove away without a destination. Just me, the quiet hum of the engine, and the tightening knot in my chest. I wasn't sure whether to be angry, heartbroken, or just tired. Months of labor, countless hours sanding, painting, fixing the damn plumbing, gone in an instant. All because she needed it more. I knew my sister Madeline. The golden child. The one who always found a way to land on her feet, because Mom and Dad made sure of it. She had never lifted a finger for them, but somehow, she was the one who always deserved more. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, my mind had cleared just enough to make a decision. If they were taking everything I built, then I wasn't going to leave empty-handed. I poured myself a drink and sat down at my laptop. It was time to remind them of one very important fact: this was my house. And they had just signed away their right to it without even realizing it. I opened my laptop and pulled up the scanned copies of every document I had collected during the renovation process. Receipts, invoices, contracts, I had it all. But the most important document? The agreement my parents had signed months ago. It wasn't some simple, informal arrangement. It was a transfer of ownership. See, when I started pouring money into the house, I made them sign a contract, nothing too formal, just something I had drafted with a friend who worked in real estate. It stated that since I was paying for the renovations and covering the property taxes, they were transferring the deed to me. It was a fair deal. They had been the ones who insisted I take over the house someday, and at the time, they signed it without a second thought. Because why would they ever think their own son would use it against them? I pulled up the county records and confirmed what I already knew: the house was legally mine. And they had no idea. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. They thought they could just push me aside, as if my time and money meant nothing. But in their eagerness to play favorites, they had made one massive mistake. They never bothered to read what they signed. I picked up my phone, hesitated for a second, then sent a single message to my dad. "You and Mom need to move out. Immediately." Then I waited. It didn't take long. My phone buzzed barely a minute after I hit send. "Dad, what the hell are you talking about?" I stared at the message, feeling nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. Just a quiet, satisfying resolve. Me, check the deed. The house is in my name now. I imagined him sitting in his recliner, squinting at his phone, turning to my mother in confusion. Then, the moment it clicked, that cold, sharp realization hitting like a slap to the face. The phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. And again. I didn't answer. I wanted them to stew in it. 20 minutes later, another text popped up. Mom, sweetheart, what is this about? Why are you saying these things? Ah. The classic. Let's pretend we don't understand what's happening. Routine. I could already hear her voice, dripping with forced concern. She would act like this was just a silly misunderstanding, that I was overreacting, that it was all just one big mistake. But there was no mistake. I had been paying the property taxes for the last 2 years. The renovation receipts were in my name. And that contract they had signed? It was legally binding. I didn't need their permission to take back what was already mine. So I sent one last text before turning off my phone for the night. Me, you have 72 hours to move out. And then, for the first time in months, I slept like a baby. I woke up the next morning to a flood of missed calls and text messages. My parents had gone through every stage of denial overnight: confusion, anger, bargaining, all neatly laid out in my inbox. Dad, this is a joke. You can't be serious. Mom, honey, let's talk about this. You don't mean it. Dad, you're out of your mind if you think we're leaving our own house. Mom, your sister needs this place. You already have your own apartment. Dad, if you don't answer, you'll regret this. There it was. The threat. I expected it to come sooner or later. My father wasn't the kind of man who liked being outplayed, especially by his own son. I ignored the messages and went about my day. I had already anticipated their reaction, and I knew the next step: they would try to call my bluff. Sure enough, by the afternoon, my mother left me a voicemail in her sweetest, most pitiful tone. We've lived here for years, sweetheart. You wouldn't really kick us out, would you? I mean, where would we even go? I played the message twice. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she acknowledge what they had done to me. It was all manipulation. They were banking on the idea that I wouldn't actually follow through. That I would give in like I always did. But this time, I was ready. I drafted an official eviction notice and emailed it to them, along with a PDF of the signed property transfer. They had 72 hours. No negotiations. No compromises. And then, I did something even better. I called the utility companies. Since everything was under my name, I had the power to shut it all down. Gas, electricity, water, gone. By the time night fell, my parents were sitting in a cold, dark house, probably still thinking this was just some elaborate bluff. It wasn't. By the next morning, my mother was calling nonstop. I let it go to voicemail. But then, at around noon, something unexpected happened. My sister, Madeline, called. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Finally, she huffed. Took you long enough. I smirked. Surprised you're even calling me. You're making this a huge deal for no reason. She snapped. Dad's furious. Mom's crying. Just be a decent person and let them stay. I let out a short laugh. A decent person? That's rich, coming from you. You knew they were kicking me out of the house after I spent months fixing it, didn't you? She didn't answer right away. That told me everything I needed to know. It's not like that, she finally muttered. They just thought I needed it more. I clenched my jaw. And what about what I needed, Madeline? What about me? You already have a place, she shot back, her voice rising. I have 2 kids. You don't even have a family. Ah. There it was. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. That's not my problem. And in case you forgot, this house isn't theirs to give away. It's mine. You're being selfish. I nearly laughed out loud. Selfish? I spent my own money fixing up that house while Mom and Dad sat back and did nothing. I paid the bills. I made it livable. And when I was finally about to move in, Dad threw me aside like I was nothing. And I'm the selfish one? She sighed heavily. Look, I don't want to argue. Just be reasonable. Let's talk about this. No, I said flatly. You have 48 hours before I get the lawyers involved. She gasped. You wouldn't. Try me. And then, for the first time ever, I hung up on her. I had always been the one to compromise. The one to back down. But not anymore. This time, I wasn't going to lose. And by the next day, my parents would finally realize it. The next morning, I woke up to a pounding on my apartment door. I already knew who it was before I even checked the peephole. I took my time opening it, letting them stew in their own impatience. When I finally pulled the door open, I was greeted by my father's red, furious face and my mother's puffy eyes. Madeline stood behind them, arms crossed, like she was watching some courtroom drama unfold. "You've gone too far this time," Dad growled, pushing his way inside. I didn't stop him. Let him come in. Let him feel like he still had control, for now. Mom sniffled. "How could you do this to us?" I shut the door behind them, crossed my arms, and leaned against the wall. "How could I do this to you?" I repeated, voice cold. "That's funny. I was just about to ask you the same thing." "Don't start with that crap," Dad snapped. "You think you can just take the house away from your own parents? Your own family?" I let out a short laugh. "I didn't take anything. You signed it over to me. Remember?" I pulled out my phone, opened the scanned document, and held it up for them to see. The contract. Their signatures. The legally binding agreement that gave me full ownership of the house. Dad's face darkened. "You tricked us." I lowered the phone, shaking my head. "I didn't trick anyone. You just didn't care enough to read what you were signing. You thought I was an easy mark, someone who'd keep giving without ever asking for anything in return." I gestured at Madeline. "Like you always do." She scowled. "Don't drag me into this." "Oh, you're already in it, Maddie," I said, voice sharp. "Because this is your fault. You could have said no. You could have told Mom and Dad that what they were doing wasn't right. But you didn't. Because you knew they'd choose you over me. They always have." She looked away. Mom let out another dramatic sniffle. "This isn't fair. We're your parents. We raised you." I arched a brow. "Did you? Or did you just keep me around until I became useful?" Silence. Dad clenched his jaw. "Listen, you little..." "Careful." I cut him off, voice calm. "Because I have everything in writing. And if you keep pushing me, I'll let my lawyer handle the rest." Dad inhaled sharply through his nose. Mom looked at me with something that almost resembled fear. And Madeline, she was finally realizing that, for the first time in our lives, I had won. "You have until tomorrow to leave," I continued, keeping my tone even. "If you're not out by then, I'll have the sheriff handle it." "You wouldn't," Mom whispered. I met her eyes. "Try me." Dad turned, storming toward the door. He yanked it open so hard I thought the hinges might snap. Mom trailed after him, dabbing at her eyes like a soap opera actress. Madeline hesitated. "You really hate me that much?" I sighed. "I don't hate you, Madeline. But I'm done putting you first." She didn't have a response to that. Instead, she just shook her head and walked out. I locked the door behind them and exhaled, finally letting the tension drain from my body. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being left behind. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they would finally understand what it felt like. The next morning, I checked the security cameras I had installed around the house weeks ago, just a precaution during renovations. The feed loaded quickly, and sure enough, my parents' car was still in the driveway. They hadn't moved out. I expected this. They were stubborn, convinced I wouldn't follow through. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. "Hi, I need to file an official eviction," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The occupants were given notice and refused to leave." The officer on the other end asked for details, and I gave them everything: the deed, the signed contract, the text confirming I had told them to vacate. "Understood," the officer said. "We'll send someone over today to make sure they comply." I thanked him, hung up, and let out a slow breath. One way or another, they were leaving today. I drove to the house around noon, just as the sheriff's deputy was pulling up. My parents were outside by then, standing on the porch like they owned the place, like they weren't squatters refusing to leave. My dad had his arms crossed, his jaw set in that way he always did when he thought he could intimidate someone into backing down. My mom stood next to him, wringing her hands, while Madeline hovered nearby, glaring at me like I was the villain in all of this. The deputy, a tall, broad man with a calm but firm presence, stepped out of his cruiser and adjusted his belt. "Are you the property owner?" he asked me. I nodded and handed him the documents. The house was legally transferred to me months ago. They were given notice to leave and refused. The deputy took a few minutes to look over everything before turning to my father. Sir, you and your family are being evicted. You need to leave the premises immediately. Dad scoffed. This is our home. No, sir, the deputy replied, his voice flat. The paperwork is clear. You forfeited ownership. If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to remove you. Mom started crying, big, dramatic sobs like she thought it would change anything. We're his parents. He can't just throw us out on the street. I crossed my arms. You threw me out first. Remember? Madeline stepped forward, her face twisted in rage. You're doing this out of spite. You already have a place to live. Why do you even need this house? I laughed. Why do you need it? You have your own home, Madeline. But that didn't stop you from taking what was supposed to be mine. Her mouth opened, but she had no comeback for that. The deputy sighed, clearly having dealt with situations like this before. You have an hour to collect your belongings, he told them. If you refuse, we'll escort you off the property. Dad looked like he wanted to argue, but then he must have realized that this was real. That he wasn't going to win this time. So, with a furious shake of his head, he turned and stormed into the house. Mom kept crying. Madeline muttered curses under her breath. And I just stood there, watching as they finally experienced what it felt like to be discarded. An hour later they were gone. And the house? It was finally mine. I stood in the doorway long after they had driven off, letting the silence settle around me. The house was empty now, just me and the space I had poured months of my life into. The fresh paint, the polished floors, the fixed plumbing, everything was exactly as I had left it. But for the first time, it actually felt like mine. No voices arguing in the background. No guilt weighing on my chest. Just peace. I walked from room to room, running my fingers over the walls, the countertops, the little details I had carefully worked on. They had expected me to roll over like I always did, to give, to sacrifice, to let them take and take until there was nothing left of me. But this time, I had stood my ground. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my mother. Mom, I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family. I exhaled slowly, then typed my response. Me no, Mom. I just finally stopped letting you destroy me. Then, without hesitation, I blocked her number. I did the same to my father. Then Madeline. One by one, I removed them from my life, just as easily as they had tried to remove me from my home. I stepped outside and took a deep breath of fresh air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the yard I had landscaped with my own 2 hands. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in their shadow. I wasn't their backup plan, their safety net, their afterthought. I was free. And as I closed the door behind me, locking them out for good, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let them take anything from me again. A week passed. A week of pure silence. No calls. No texts. Nothing. I thought maybe they had finally accepted their loss, that they'd moved on like I had. But deep down, I knew them too well. People like my parents and Madeline didn't just let things go. They plotted. They waited. And sure enough, when trouble finally came knocking, I wasn't even surprised. It started with a knock on my front door. Not angry. Not urgent. Just patient. I opened it to find my uncle, my dad's older brother, Uncle Rick. The one relative in the family who had never quite fit into their little favoritism circle. He was standing on my new porch, hands in his pockets, looking at me like he had just walked into the middle of a storm. Well, he said, shaking his head. You really did it, huh? I shrugged. They gave me no choice. He let out a low chuckle. That's the part they're struggling with the most, the fact that you actually stood up to them. I crossed my arms. Let me guess. They sent you? Rick sighed. Not exactly. Your dad's too proud to ask for help, but your mom? She's been calling me non-stop, playing the poor me routine. Wanted me to come talk some sense into you. I exhaled, already exhausted by the idea. And? He smirked. And I told her she should have read the damn contract before signing it. That made me pause. I hadn't expected that. Rick wasn't the kind of guy to get involved in family drama, But he also wasn't blind to how my parents had treated me over the years. If anything, he had always been the only one who saw through their act. Look, he continued, leaning against the railing. I'm not here to guilt-trip you, kid. I think what you did, long overdue. But I figured you should know what they've been up to. I frowned. What do you mean? He gave me a knowing look. They're scrambling. Hard. They thought they could just stay with Madeline, but... He let out a laugh, shaking his head. Turns out she doesn't actually want them there full-time. She's already complaining that they're too much work and messing up her routine. I nearly laughed. The same sister who needed the house more? The one they had thrown me aside for? Now she didn't want them either? You're kidding, I said. Wish I was. But nah, she's been calling them a burden behind their backs. I guess it's different when she's the one being drained. I ran a hand down my face, barely containing my amusement. Unbelievable. Rick nodded. Yeah. And now? They're talking about getting legal advice, seeing if there's any way to challenge the deed transfer. But between you and me? He smirked. They don't have a leg to stand on. They signed it fair and square. I let out a slow breath. So what now? He shrugged. That depends on you. You've won. You could ignore them forever, let them figure out their mess. Or... He gave me a sideways glance. You could throw them a bone, just to be the bigger person. I considered it for a moment. The idea of offering them anything after what they had done. It left a bitter taste in my mouth. But then I remembered all the years of being overlooked. Of being the last priority. The ATM they never thanked. They had thrown me away without hesitation. And now? They were finally learning what it felt like. I met Rick's gaze. They made their choice. He grinned. Figured you'd say that. He turned to leave but paused on the steps. For what it's worth, kid, I'm proud of you. Should have done this a long time ago. I watched as he walked back to his car and drove away. The moment the taillights disappeared, I took one last look at the house, my house. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. They were. And I wasn't going to lose sleep over it. As I stepped inside and shut the door, I knew one thing for certain. I had finally won.